I am gonna start today's video with a question that I think we all need to ask ourselves more often. What if something that was lost in the distant past could help us solve problems in the modern day? This event is known as the Bronze Age collapse, and it is one of the biggest mysteries in archaeology. Because when we look at history, there are these big gaps where entire cultures just sort of vanish. One of the most famous examples is the Indus Valley civilization, and to get to those guesses, we need to step back a bit and talk about what life was like during the Bronze Age. Many of these trade routes, however, passed through what we today call Turkey, specifically a region known as Anatolia. And what makes this significant is that somewhere in Anatolia lay the city of Kazela, which at the time was one of the world's largest and most important trading hubs. Between roughly 3,300 and 1200 BCE, the Earth's population grew significantly thanks to innovations like the plow and irrigation, which allowed humans to grow more food and therefore support larger populations. Now, archaeologists aren't entirely sure why this happened. According to the text, the Kaska came from the mountains, the Laka came from the sea, and the Sherden were allied with the Laka for one thing. We don't have much evidence for it outside of Anatolia and Egypt. And second, the Sea Peoples are mentioned in texts from before the collapse. They call it the 8.2 kiloyear event because it happened roughly 8,100 years ago. And according to some estimates, it was 14 times more powerful than the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Recent research has shown that drought and famine weren't the only factors affecting societies in this period. Basically, these attacks would have devastated the local food supply, triggered widespread famine, and destabilized the socio-political order, which is all pretty similar to what happened in the Soviet Union during the 1920s. Warfare was also a big one. Archaeological evidence suggests that as early as 1250 BCE, small groups of nomadic herders began raiding large cities. What I mean is that as droughts and famines became more common, more people began migrating into cities in search of food. I mean, they left behind some pretty incredible stuff like the Iliad and Odyssey, King Solomon's mines, and some of the earliest examples of writing. Massive cities are home to millions of people, and just like in the Bronze Age, many of these cities are highly vulnerable to natural disasters and disease outbreaks. We also face unprecedented challenges like climate change and nuclear war, which puts us in a precarious position. But more importantly, they can teach us how to avoid repeating their mistakes. And that's a lesson that we can all take to heart, whether we're talking about the environment, a pandemic, or well, anything. Sometimes the best way to deal with a complex problem is to take a lesson from the past. But I do think that the lessons we learn from past civilizations could help us build a more resilient future. Climate change, for example, cannot be solved by planting more trees or developing new technology. It will require changes to our diets, our energy consumption, and our lifestyles. Likewise, ending a global pandemic requires more than just vaccines. It also requires effective communication, public health measures, and international cooperation. The Bronze Age collapse shows us that even the most advanced societies can fall apart in a matter of decades. But these cities couldn't produce enough food to support the influx of people, so they became more and more unstable. Whatever the cause, a period of rapid climatic change seems to have coincided nicely with the collapse. And boom, we have a collapse. It's also possible that infectious disease played a role, although that one's still up for debate. And they disappear from the historical record after it happens, which doesn't really make sense if they were responsible for causing it, which has led some scholars to believe that the Sea Peoples were a confederation of various non-state actors who banded together to raid coastal cities. Around 1200 BCE, the Earth entered a period of rapid climatic change. Instead, the collapse was likely caused by a combination of everything: droughts, famines, warfare, disease, societal pressure, and maybe even volcanic eruptions. All of these factors combined in a deadly synergy that caused the collapse of many of the world's great civilizations. Temperatures plummeted, droughts became more frequent and widespread, and volcanic eruptions shrouded the world in ash and debris. More recent research suggests that it wasn't climate change that caused the collapse, but rather the collapse that caused the climate to change. Basically, the massive depopulation caused by the collapse reduced the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which led to a cooling effect that lasted for centuries. Around the same time, trade also seemed to grind to a halt in Mesopotamia and along the Mediterranean coast. There was also less long-distance maritime trade which all goes to show that whatever caused the collapse of Kaisela didn't just affect a small corner of the world. It affected everyone. Maybe it was destroyed by an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, or an invading army. But whoever or whatever did it sure made an impact, because archaeological evidence suggests that it took decades, if not centuries, for trade to return to Anatolia. As a result, towns and cities became bigger and more densely populated. For centuries, we thought that it had fallen to pieces around 1900 BC, but recent research suggests that it may have survived until as late as 1300 BCE. But why? Well, the traditional explanation is that the Sea Peoples did it. The Sea Peoples were a mysterious confederation of maritime raiders who terrorized the Mediterranean between 1100 and 1150 BCE. They're mentioned in Egyptian texts as well as on the famous Tel El Mana tablets, which were discovered in 1938. That's still a pretty dramatic drop-off though. In less than a millennium, their cities were completely abandoned. It was such a pivotal moment in human history that many scholars consider it to be second only to the emergence of agriculture itself. So here's what happened, why it happened, and why it matters for all of us today. And no, I am not talking about ancient Egyptian medicine or those weird leeches they used to use back in the Middle Ages. I'm talking about complex societal collapse. What if by studying how past civilizations fell apart, we can better understand how to keep from doing the same thing today? Their palatial system collapsed around 1100 BCE, but some settlements stayed occupied while others were totally abandoned, and there is no telling what happened to the people who lived there. The Hittites in Anatolia, the Canaanites, and the Egyptians all experienced similar collapses within a few hundred years of each other. But maybe even more intriguing is that none of these cultures left behind any written records of their own decline. It turns out this might be more important than you think, because around 1200 BCE, most of the world's major civilizations just kind of stopped existing. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about what exactly we mean when we say that civilizations collapsed. But perhaps even more dramatic than that was the Mycenaean civilization in Greece, which reached its peak around 1600 BC after centuries of war. So what happened to them? Well, we don't know for sure, but we do have some pretty good guesses. Trade networks stretched across continents. People traveled further and more frequently than ever before, and new technology spread rapidly throughout the world. What's also interesting is that around 1200 BCE, Kaisala suddenly disappears. And if we zoom out, this is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. In fact, it seems as though every civilization that participated in long-distance trade networks was affected in some way. The tablets contain a Hittite text that describes an alliance between the Kaskar, the Laka, and the Sherdan, two of whom are listed as seafaring nations. However, the idea that the Sea Peoples were solely responsible for the Bronze Age collapse is problematic to say the least. For those reasons, many scholars today reject the Sea Peoples theory altogether and instead point to climate change as the culprit behind the Bronze Age collapse. Some scholars even claim that a volcanic eruption in modern-day Greenland could be responsible for the collapse. So maybe it was just Mother Nature who turned up her AC a few notches too high. Well, not so fast. But wait, it gets weirder, because the Bronze Age collapse may not have been a natural disaster at all. And given that the victims of these attacks were often wealthier and more centralized, some scholars hypothesize that they were targeted intentionally. This has led some scholars to argue that the Bronze Age collapse was caused by a runaway process of socio-ecological feedbacks. And as they became more unstable, they were more vulnerable to attack. And as they were more vulnerable to attack, they became even more unstable. All of which is to say that there is no single factor that we can point to and say, aha, this is why the Bronze Age collapsed. But even though they're gone, they can still teach us a lot. After all, today we live in another period of rapid technological and societal change. Global trade networks stretch across continents. To be clear, I am not saying that we are on the brink of civilizational collapse. I am not saying that at all. And it also shows us that we shouldn't rely on just one solution to fix a complex problem. In other words, it requires all of us to work together.